Strangely enough, after that news, if you have internalized that, and especially for some people that have a great, I think even it's a gift of empathy, and you can place yourself there in a sense, or really empathy is drawing on your own experiences in some way to relate to others. If you're really good at that, then oddly enough, anything I'm about to say is going to be impossible for you to receive. It just is. The way that we are designed, and it's strange too, because that's the exact message that I'm delivering to you today. And I'm not even joking. I hope you can catch some of this. The common expression, "I was beside myself," is perhaps one of the most amazing idioms in our language. Really, after Christmas and Advent, we move from a season of focusing on Jesus being near to us and what that does to us in our giving and our relating to others. And the reality of New Year's, it's like it throws it out the window. Now, it's like the trick of the world in a sense. Stop thinking about Jesus and others, and now focus on yourself and what you want to be. It's like the world's reset button, trying to get us to be selfish and so introspective that we fail to consider the impact on others still. I was beside myself. That would be the experience, even now in a sense, of trying to come to grips with. But maybe you yourself have experienced being beside yourself. Both good and bad emotions go with that. But the reality of what that encapsulates is that you were so polarized in the way that you felt that you really felt like you weren't even yourself. Do you notice that theme in this scripture? Jesus has been gone, and they realize it. Where was he? He was in the temple, in his Father's house. They were beside themselves. Now, the Greek word there is what led me to this idiom, which, by the way, was present in that culture. They had the same kind of description in their language. And this word is not the same exact word that's used just a few verses before it, but it's very similar, from same roots. And it really, one word more than the other, really points to being beside oneself. Do you know where the other part of that is? The other occurrence in this scripture, besides Mary and Joseph? Who else was beside themselves? The teachers in the temple. It says they were amazed or astounded. I'm not sure which one. I can't place who was amazed and who was astounded, but those are the two interpretations in the version that we read today. But there's the common theme of this scripture, is that they were beside themselves with Jesus. It doesn't say that they were beside themselves when they couldn't find Jesus, but when they saw him. If you look at it, that's exactly what you see. When they saw him, they experienced something like an out-of-mind, out-of-body experience. and not in the good way. They could not believe it. Beside themselves. They were at that uppermost limit or pole of emotion. I want to give you 3 thoughts for today and a conclusion. Growth is not one-dimensional. If you look at verse 52, it says that Jesus did what? Grew in what ways? In wisdom, in stature, in favor with God and with people. So really 4 things, because he grew in favor with God and people. Wisdom, stature, in favor. I'm going to say mentally, physically, spiritually, and socially. Growth applies to all of those things, and we don't get a clear picture of how that happened. How did Jesus do that? We don't really see it. I will just kind of back up for a second and point out that this scripture was given to me as a challenging scripture for how Jesus wasn't perfect when I was a young man. This is how Jesus messed up here on the earth. I would just remind everyone that his parents, in his response to them was what? Surely you knew. I mean, I tried to examine the Greek of this, and this is basically how it comes out. Come on, you didn't know that I was going to be in my Father's house? This is where you left me, basically, right? This is where he would have been left, right? It doesn't say he left them or that he was disobedient. He was there. That's why they were there, to visit the temple. They were at the temple and they left him. Surely that 3 days could have been a lot shorter if they had really understood who he was. But they didn't get it yet. He was there because that's where he would be. If Jesus grew in wisdom and stature, in favor with God, in favor with man, that seems like a pretty good place for us to sort of break down how we're supposed to grow. Growth, though, begins with discomfort or unease. And with that said, I'm going to tell you that I'm sort of borrowing from this concept of being beside oneself. And if you look at the teachers, and if you look at Mary and Joseph, they knew so much. They had it all together. Mary herself, labeled as having favor with God herself, and yet she didn't make the connection. And she became beside herself when she saw Jesus. That's not a comfortable place. But right there, she learned something, didn't she? She had a realization. And again, it talks about her treasuring these things, taking these things in, and pondering on them. That's what happens when we become beside ourselves. It's uncomfortable. And we have to sort of unpack it and address it. And though growth begins there, it can't actually happen all there. You know, I think back to my roots in Pentecostal circles, and I will forever be annoyed by the term that some people use when people get saved or come to Christ or get excited about Jesus. Do you know what that term is? It's my little soapbox moment. They're on fire for Jesus. Boy, they're really on fire. They're really on fire. And as great as that is boasted to be, being on fire is not where it stops. When we're out of our mind or out of our normal self, when we're looking on ourselves in this incredulous way, I can't believe this, It can be moments of discovery where that happens. And that's the beginning of growth. But it's uncomfortable. It's uneasy. Mary and Joseph experienced it. The teachers listened to him, and they experienced it. They couldn't believe his answers when they questioned him. They couldn't believe his questions. And the obvious real-world scenario for what happens in growth is that when you lift weights, it's not fun. What happens on the biological level is that you're actually kind of tearing your muscles up. But why does that happen? So that you can grow in your recovery time. That's where the growth really comes out. Growth is not the sudden realization of a truth discovered. Growth is the coming down from cloud 9 experience, settling into a new framework, but it's initiated in that discomfort and unease. It's not necessarily a pleasant experience. In fact, we all avoid being out of our mind. We all avoid being beside ourselves as much as possible. So, how might we grow like Jesus did? Growth has to move beyond being beside ourselves. But if you don't use that experience, I wonder if those teachers who were beside themselves could have been there some 20 years later, shouting, "Crucify, crucify, crucify him." We can all have that experience and still find ourselves in the wrong place. There are 4 areas of growth, right, that I mentioned. And I'm going to address each and every one of those. Then I'll give you a conclusion. So as we think on our 2019, this could apply to us. Christ grew in wisdom. I'm going to say that's a mental growth. That's an intellectual sort of growth. Jesus answered questions and taught. That's a pretty good example. How do we grow? Maybe by asking good questions and even teaching. Expose yourself to new thoughts. Do you think Jesus avoided the controversies of his day? Do you think he shied away from groups that were passionately preaching one thing? I don't think so. Out of his desire for peace, I don't think that he avoided the tough conversations. So engage with others and even material with viewpoints that are different than your own. Now, of course, this isn't from the Bible, is it? This is just about how to interact with the world. And maybe this is my pastoral advice in growth. Engaging with others and materials and viewpoints that are not your own are not comfortable. But let me say this. If you've had the same viewpoints for a decade, consider revisiting it. And then I would also say, literally find scripture that backs the viewpoints that you hold, especially viewpoints, and listen to me, especially viewpoints that can disregard the well-being of others, especially ones that may not line up with the core of scriptural teaching. I'm not getting political. I'm not trying to get political. There are a lot of things that politically right now can apply to this. But if our viewpoints cannot be backed up by the core of Scripture, we should revisit it. In doing so, even if we find ourselves in the same place, we are stronger at engaging ourselves in those tough conversations. Ask yourself, does this line up? Secondly, Jesus grew in stature. You may second guess me regarding the validity of using Jesus as an example, citing that this scripture merely lists a fact about Jesus' growth. That may be fair, so at worst, again, I offer you some pastoral thoughts. Without scriptural authority, I'll even go that far. Merely listing something about Jesus that could be true, just like wisdom. The world in which these things were written had no shortage of exercise and did not face an abundance of food-like substances, many of which are designed to be addictive or are just coincidentally so due to their composition. Had the world then been filled with the things that our world is filled with, I cannot help but wonder if the physician's book, Luke's book, his gospel, would speak to us more pointedly about the things that we do with our bodies. Would he encourage us to avoid things and be, almost in a scary place of saying, you can't do this, right? Like the law did? I don't know. But I can't help but think that he probably would. There might be something from a physician, Luke, that would say, this is what you need to do to be healthy now. They didn't face that. They don't face that reality. And then, moving on, favor with God spiritually. How do you grow spiritually? Well, this is the heart and soul of this church, right? We all know how to grow spiritually. We can rattle off some core disciplines by which you grow spiritually. And I think that's a great place to review as you think about what your 2019 might be. But maybe think about breaking down the barriers that you've experienced before. Disciplines that have been beyond your capability, so it seems. And I'll say this, as my last thought on disciplines in the spiritual life. The older I get, the more I see God in every part of it. Consider that the disciplines that apply to your spirituality are life-encompassing. And then lastly, favor with people. His social influence. What does that even mean? Maybe think about the barriers that society puts up between people, and think a moment with yourself in terms of race. Wow, that's pushing the envelope, Rick. Think about how you place yourself in terms of race. Are you able to be social with people who don't look like you? Are you able to influence and be influenced by people that don't look like you? Do you benefit from and give benefit to people that don't look like you? Now for us, we look around and it's pretty homogeneous here. At this moment, not much diversity. That does not stop us from going beyond being like ourselves. And what about those who are different ages than you? Now, ageism is real. I've had a lot of conversations about this recently. But I'm addressing you folks. You can look around. We see what each other's ages are based on the reflection of our bodies, right? So, take that into mind. I'm not talking to young people right now. I have something different to challenge young people with. There are few things more disappointing to me than hearing mature people express disappointment of the younger generation, either in their family or in society, while also observing their unwillingness to engage themselves in conversations or in settings that enable exposure to wisdom from both generations. Now, I love people who can play with little children. I don't know about you guys, but I find it extremely difficult to get on that level of the youngest level of play. My mother is amazing at it. She can sit and take little characters with little kids, and she can get into that world. It's like, it's a strange thing the times that I have done that. My world changes and I see a world differently through these little creatures or things. And you engage with them on a level that you are not at. And even that is a social challenge for all of us. When we think in terms of being better people, these are not typical things to think about. But we can challenge ourselves to relate with people that we don't normally relate to. And age is also one of those social elements. It's not just race. It's not just culture. It's also age. I also want to mention to you that those who are older I've seen this. This is like my assessment of you. You can stone me later. It's so funny. It's like, even as I was reviewing this, like, man, people are going to really hate me for these things. But it is what it is, right? This is real. This is a challenge. I mean, I'm trying to apply Jesus's model in a way that is real and challenging. A lot of people think that the youth culture has all the power. That's a general assessment that, you watch TV and it's geared to youth culture, and it's that, beauty is valuable, and that's what's valued. So we as we get older, we tend to think that we are on the outs now. We don't have the power anymore. But as a way of example of helping you to be beside yourself, maybe this will put you beside yourself. Hopefully you can still hear the conclusion even if you are. Some argue that the youth culture has too much power over society. But think about this. As I'm challenging you to think differently and reevaluate how you interact socially, you might make some discoveries, very simple ones. Now, this is not true here. But as I say this, you might start to feel something. You could get beside yourself. So here you go. What do we communicate to youth and children if the majority of our activity as a church, our programming, our music, our education is directed towards adults? When our hymns and music are 200 years old, do we communicate something to young people when we send them to the basement in the middle of our church service? Do they get a message that we don't want them to get? Really, when we think about these things, we put everything back on the table and try to think fresh and new. If we demonstrate our annoyance at their lack of impulse control, the dirt that they track in, or the inappropriate play in the church, do they hear a mixed message about their value? I think they could. Now, like I said, I don't think that's true here. I think there's a lot of things that we demonstrate. But those are the kind of things that come up when you evaluate your interactions. The point is, we naturally operate well with those who we are similar to, and it sometimes takes intentional thought, even an outsider's perspective, to identify dysfunction. I would like to think that growing socially has much to do with becoming influential as well. Sometimes this requires being beside ourselves or having those realizations, those eureka moments that help us to connect on a personal level. And if you want to be truly impactful in the world, you absolutely, listen to this, you absolutely must embrace the idea that you will be out of your mind or beside yourself, both in terms of infuriating ideas that the world is promoting. You're going to have to interact with those. And in terms of injustices. In fact, if you want to grow socially, you have to run towards those issues. Run towards that discomfort. It's not comfortable seeing homeless people. It's not comfortable being a white man and being told that I am the problem with our culture. And yet, that's where I face myself many days of the week. And that is one of the challenges that I face. Is white privilege real? That's a question that I work with. It's not comfortable to become knowledgeable and engage others in those conversations. But even that is spiritual growth because it's social growth. So, concluding. Here you go. You guys are ready to be done with this one, I know. As we continue to consider what our lives should be like, we look to our example, Jesus. When we find him, even over and over again in new ways, we will be beside ourselves. But we can't stay there. Jesus is always moving us to new growth. The most important thing to remember from today's scripture, apart from my ramblings, is even that with Jesus, we can be with Jesus anywhere, wherever he moves us. And we always know where he is. Where is he? He's in his Father's house. We always know that, and we can be transformed in his presence. We may feel like it's an unsafe thing that makes us beside ourselves, but this is where Jesus is. That's the place that Jesus is at. The place that makes you beside yourself. It's not safe, and yet in his presence we are safe. That is, unless you don't really trust in him. Think about this encouragement in relationship to being beside yourself. Last thing, here it is. Last statement. Think about this relationship between being beside yourself and what I'm about to say. Put yourself out there. Being beside yourself, amazed, astounded, in that state of disbelief. Beside yourself, put yourself out there. After all, that's where Jesus is. Amen.